I'm sorry I wasn't here last week. I've had this terrible flu. I've still got something of a voice. I don't know whether you're picking that up, which I quite like. I'd like to keep the voice. I'd like to lose the rest of the symptoms, but keep the kind of voice and sing those kind of gravelly kind of 70s love songs. Anyway. I don't want to distract you. So I'm sorry I wasn't here last week. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about impermanence. Of course, I want to set it in context again, like I know that Subhadramati was last week. We've been talking about that. I mean, I wanted to just start with the figure of the Buddha. I was struck that Subhadramati sort of indicated the Buddha, and in a way, the Buddha is the centerpiece of this room. It's so obvious. I remember when I first came to the Wednesday class when I was 25, I'd cycled from my squat in Brixton. I was at Goldsmiths Art College at the time, so you couldn't have been cooler. Except for I was really not cool. Anyway, that's another matter. I hadn't discovered how to do that, and I still haven't. But I was at Art College there with Damien Hirst and Sarah Lucas and all those kind of people, Britpack people. And I remember coming into this room, and I remember walking into the middle and suddenly noticing this figure. And I remember having this very strange dual response, which was, on one hand, thinking, how ridiculous, how then? I was at Goldsmiths Art College. The idea of having a golden figure that represents an ideal, I mean, I don't know, it was unthinkable, unless it was a burnt tyre or a video recording of someone jumping up and down, nobody would have taken it seriously. So I remember thinking, how kind of embarrassing, how kind of Victorian, I had that response, and it was exactly the same time, quite to my own surprise, I had this sort of sense of jubilation, a real sense of jubilation. I thought, how embarrassing and how wonderful, at exactly the same time. I remember thinking that it was much bigger than it actually is. How rooms do that, and figures do that. Do go for Vadrasana, we've got this wonderful, larger figure. But I had that dual sense of sort of embarrassment and sort of, oh golly, you don't do that. You don't have an image for an ideal. That's embarrassing. That's what the Victorians did, and we've tried to get away as far away from the Victorians as possible. But at the same time, thinking how wonderful, just how wonderful. And the reason we have the figure in the centre of the room, in a way that the bigger the better, is because everything that we're trying to do in this room, everything to do with Buddhism, really needs this figure in the centre of it. It needs not just an image of the Buddha, it needs the Buddha in glory. This is how I always imagine this figure, the Buddha in glory, surrounded by golden halos, sitting on a fully open lotus leaf on a white moon mat, which is basically the moon. He's sitting on the moon, which clearly is a symbol of beauty and purity, but also mystery, I always think. What would it be like if you visionarily saw a golden figure sitting on a moon? Sometimes you even have them sitting on the moon and the sun, which represents, timelessness. So everything in Buddhism has got that kind of figure of glory in the centre of it. And this figure of glory represents the possibility of a wholly new way of being in the world. There's no adequate way of putting it. You could say a wholly new kind of consciousness, but that sounds a little bit to do with thought and mind, because it's also a wholly new way of feeling for other people, and a wholly new basis on which to feel for other people. It's a wholly new agency in the world. You see how that's a very different metaphor than consciousness. In other words, what makes you do anything, including literally get up in the morning, is wholly changed. A whole new basis on which to feel for people, and what that means even, what feeling for people might mean, a new kind of consciousness. It's unimaginable to us. A while ago I was giving a talk entitled What is Enlightenment? And my partner's daughter, Ria, she said to me, what's the subject? And I said, enlightenment. She said, that sounds boring. And she's quite right in a way, because the word doesn't really have any real content. It sounds abstract and so on. It's much better to have the image, an image of glory. And this image, yes, represents this wholly new way of being in the world, a wholly new agency, a wholly new basis for emotion, a different world really as well. Because when you change your consciousness, your world changes. You've experienced this already to some degree. As soon as you're in a negative state of mind, things seem to get in your way. People seem to slow down in front of you. Negative things seem to happen to you. It seems to be slightly darker and less pleasant. As soon as you're in a negative state of mind, you notice anything that fits with a negative state of mind, and I say you and me, all of us, we then embellish that and see more and more elements for that. Yeah? As soon as you're in a positive state of mind, things seem to run much more smoothly. Things seem to be less jagged and so on. But you can change your state of mind to such a degree that the world, what we call the world, which, remember, we don't actually know what that is, but anyway, so many of the things we call like mind and world, we don't know what they mean, but it completely changes. As soon as your mind changes, your world changes, and that continues and continues. To an element in this figure that you can't really describe. In fact, trying to describe it is usually a mistake. It's much better, really, just to sit with the image. So when we're thinking about doorways to liberation, when we're thinking of prajna, which is a Buddhist word for wisdom, we really need to think of it always with this radiant, golden figure in our midst. Yeah? A figure that is loving in a way that we can't understand, which feels both incredibly intimate but universal at the same time and kind of impersonal. Those two poles aren't problematized in that consciousness. A figure that feels incredibly wise but doesn't think in the usual way that we do, that doesn't churn over stuff in their mind. A figure that's constantly full of energy, sort of a fire of energy. So we need to have this sense that there is another wholly other way of being in this world, and all Buddhist practice is to try to access that wholly other way of being in this world. We all have glimmers of it from time to time, and I might even tell you some of mine, but that's what we're trying to get at. And one of the classic ways of trying to get at this wholly new way of being in the world, which is Buddhahood, which feels like, apparently, according to my understanding at least, and according to the sutras, feels like that's exactly what the universe, the world, reality needs you to be. The reality, the world, the universe needs you to be a Buddha, because that's the only way that it all works. That when you're a Buddha, when you've got any degree of insight into how things are, you realise that you had been wholly mistaken about very basic things like the nature of perception, the nature of time and space, and so on. Yeah? So you can't. It's very difficult to talk about that new consciousness, that new agency, that new basis for emotion. So the main thing is really sort of practically to try to think, well, how do we move towards it? And the first thing I wanted to say about that, before I come on to this reflection of impermanence, is one of the things that I've been struck by is one of the primary things we need to cultivate is our interest. It's all very well and grand to talk about glowing golden figures and so on, but we've got to get interested. And what we're trying to get is intrinsically interested, which is different from trying to be interested, which is different from wanting to be interested, which is different from thinking you ought to be interested. Yeah, I find interest itself more and more kind of interesting. It's very unusual when you think about the nature of interest. So what got me thinking on this line of inquiry was a phone call from Ria. She's 10 now, and it's easy to forget that children have interests just like adults do, and they're just as specialised. So she rang me and she said, "Did you change the book that you bought for you for Christmas?" And I said, "I haven't yet." No, she said, "That's good, because I've read this one, I've read that." And she rattled off all these titles by the same author that she'd read. She said, "I've read Holes, I've read Fuzzy Mud, I've read There's a Boy in the Girls' Bathroom. So which other ones were you considering?" And of course I hadn't considered. I just need to take you back to the shop. And I said, "Let me just have a look online." So I looked at Louis Satcher. She's very interested in Louis Satcher. So I looked at some titles and I said, "Well, there's this one. I can't remember what it's called now, Pigsty or something." And she said, "Oh, no, I've seen the blurb of that one. I didn't find that very interesting." Oh, okay, not that Louis Satcher. So I read her some other. She said, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Could you read me the blurb? This is all on the phone." And I'm thinking, I've got a bit to do, but no. Yeah, I'll just read you the blurb. And she said, "Yes, that sounds good. Perhaps write that one down." So and I was really struck by it. And then I dutifully went to the shop and got her exactly the book that we'd read the blurb of and she was interested in. But I was really struck because you then go to Foyles and you go to the children's section and young, what are the young readers or something. And there's this little block of Louis Satcher, some of which she's already read, one of which she's decided is really not up her street. But next to that is another block of somebody beginning with S, and there are all these other books, probably very similar. But her interest is just running around Louis Satcher, but not that one because I've read the blurb, it's not very interesting. So I was struck by the peculiarity of interest. Do you see that? And it's true for all of us, isn't it? That our interest is a strange, highly specialised thing. And it's not a thing, is it? It's a highly specialised kind of part of our sensibility. It's a crucial part of who we are. In fact, who we are is largely a consequence of what we've been interested in. In fact, you could simply say that that's who we are. We're an amalgam of all the things we've been interested in, including the negative things, probably very importantly the negative things. So if we've been interested in giving our opinion on Trump on Facebook, that's the kind of person we are. Who was it? Somebody said that everyone ends up with the face they deserve. It's a brilliant way of putting that, isn't it? That everyone ends up with the face they deserve. In other words, you end up looking like what you've been interested in. Yeah? A worrying thought. I hope I look glowing at the moment. There's this thing that's really vital for all of us, is where does our interest flow? It's very particular, isn't it? It's Louis Satcher, these books, but not that one, not the next set of people next to them, not teenage, but Louis Satcher. Do you remember what that was like when you were a child, when you won a particular writing? I remember getting this one book, and my mother got me the wrong book, and I was like, she just kind of doesn't understand me. This is not the right book. Very particular our interests are. It's something very intimate to us, the nature of our interests. And what a great part of our life is going to need to be about, especially when you're young, I think, is training your interest. So you get interested in things that actually are going somewhere, actually are going to sustain you through your life and are going to deepen your life. Yeah. I was just talking to a friend in the break, and he was saying, "Oh, I spent the last 10 years partying," and I said it's forgivable until about the age of 30, something like that. If you're doing it at my age, it's positively tragic. Anyway, but it's fine, spending the last 10 years partying, but it's not going to last you very much, and it's not much of a contribution. It's not going to deepen. In fact, you're going to lose it. At least you should lose it, because you'll be embarrassment to your friends. Nobody likes a fat uncle. I've managed to avoid the fat at least. Yeah, but how do we... Because you can't then just make yourself interested in holy things. Some people are. I mean, my very, very good friend Jan Arch is very good at being interested in the most important things. I tend to always have to go through the kitchen door to get to the most important thing. There's a big door that says, here is the Dharma, meaning, truth, beauty. And I think, not very interested. And then there's, here is the kitchen. And what I hope is by going through the kitchen and the scullery and then the servants' quarters, I somehow end up in the same room that Jan Arch is. He just goes right through the front door. So you have to kind of find a way of finding what you're interested in and getting it. You might be like me, you have to go through the kitchen or the scullery or sort of go through the bedroom often enough. Find a way of getting your interested linked up with things that are going to deepen your life. We're going to be looking at these 4 gateways, and really those are the things that we need to get interested in. But you might not be able to just get interested in that. You might not be able to just get interested in the Buddha. So I had some thoughts about how you might train your interest. I think this is absolutely crucial because it's so peculiar to us, our interest. You know how you'd like to be interested in something, but you're just not. I remember thinking I'd quite like to be interested in potted plants. I want to be those people with room with plants everywhere. But I don't really care for them. And therefore they die, a long, dry death. Actually, I'm looking after 2 at the moment. I'm just not really interested. I'd like to be, or people talk about this, all sorts of things. Oh, how interesting! But you're not really. So the first way to develop your interest is to be quite candid about what you're interested in. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The odd film. Be quite candid with yourself. You don't have to tell all your friends necessarily, but you need to be really quite candid about when you're interested and when you're not. Otherwise, you're bored pretending to be interested. That's, I think, the start of interest, is what am I actually interested in? Not what I should be interested in, not what I think is a good thing to be interested in, but what actually gets me going. What lights me up. Really, I prefer the language of eros. It really is an erotic matter, that something lights you up. Sometimes you wished it was something else, but something just touches you and lights you up. And all you're trying to do, it's a great task, is train yourself to get interested in things that light you up, that actually also deepen you, enhance you, open you up, connect you with others, and especially connect you with reality. Because reality is the only place, finally, that's interesting. Everything else dies on you. Art, love, scholarship. They all kind of thin as you get older if you're not careful. They become another kind of identity. Actually, you're trying to use all of those things to go toward reality. That's what makes life serious. I think of the Dharma life primarily as a serious life. A life with lots of jokes in it, but primarily a sort of serious life, what grown-up serious people do. Yeah. So first of all, learn what actually interests you and be quite candid about that. And investigate your interest. What is it about it? If you're interested in very beautiful young people, it's interesting that you're not even interested in all young, beautiful people, are you? You're always interested... I don't know, of course. It's been a long time. But, you're interested in particular people for all sorts of particular reasons. And it's easy to psychologize that, but perhaps it has a slightly deeper meaning than that. Try to find what you're interested in. Try and find if there's a deeper meaning to it. There nearly always is. It's just that it's mixed in with all sorts of other, very natural human things like craving, hatred, lust, and so on. Don't worry about all that. Try and get beneath all that. That's just sort of noise, and very often doesn't go very far. Doesn't take you very far. Try to get under that to, golly, why does that interest me? I've just been rereading Elizabeth Bishop for about the 14th time. And I remember trying to get Jan of Arch to be interested in Elizabeth Bishop, and he's not. He's made no bones about that. But I keep going back to her. I just think there's something I just find, so interesting. There's something for me that feels really important about her vision of things. Yeah? Any road. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to get interested in interested people. Yeah? It's not always possible to be interested yourself. You can try to be, but you know that feeling when you really try to be, but you're really actually just not? And you have to look as if you are. I think boredom is much bigger an issue for us than we make out. People talk about grief and loneliness and hatred. I think a lot of it's just simply boredom, a low-lying boredom, like a sort of low mist, that you never get really interested in anything very much. That's why things like pornography are so big. It's not because people are bad, it's just because they're slightly bored. And they want something to grab them. They want something to light them up. And it's an easy route to that. We've got to somehow find eros in our lives and then very cunningly and creatively and train it in the right direction. And one of the ways I've thought about my own life is my friends. So I think one of the ways of becoming interested is getting friends that you can be interested with. I mean, my friendship with Yanavancha, I think, is exemplary in this way. Well, he is. I don't think I am. Yanavancha, I remember when we first started meeting up and having coffee, Yanavancha would want to talk about the nature of perception. I just think, I'm from Henley and Arden, we don't do that. I'm from Warwickshire. You know what I mean? Nobody talks about the nature of perception. It sounds so dreadfully pretentious. But I remember we were trying to talk, we were going to this cafe and he was trying to talk to me about why does that tree need to be there and why can't it be anybody else at the same time. And I remember thinking, this is so irritating. But then after, what is he on? He's been smoking something. But then gradually, I thought, golly, that really is a problem. And as I talked, and because of Yanavancha's interest in that kind of metaphysical realm, which I think it's partly just an English kind of inferiority thing. I've always thought I'm not up to thinking about stuff like that. That's for sort of people who are professors or have been to Oxford. I went to Henley and Arden High School. But I think that sort of middle lower class English kind of inferiority. I just sort of think I don't think about that sort of stuff. So then talking to Yanavancha, I suddenly, golly, that's really very. I never thought of that. And then I remember we were reading this book, Confessions of a Philosopher, at the same time. Outside the Dharma, the most exhilarating book I've ever read, I think. And suddenly, you'd read sort of Kant's philosophy, and you just think. I mean, the Brahmagita is a brilliant way of describing, to see how this can't be right and that can't be true. So your assumption of that isn't right, is it? And I remember reading it on a train and thinking, oh golly, that incredible sense of, I've actually got all these assumptions and they definitely can't be right. They've got all these logical flaws. And I remember it being exhilarating and slightly terrifying that I got what I thought was just facts and the reality. They were my assumptions, and they didn't stack up. I remember he's brilliant. He'd say, okay, so Kant's first thought is this. On the basis of that, this. On the basis of that. And then Schopenhauer says it. And you sort of think, yeah, I get that, yeah. And you say, oh! And you go, no, start again. No. I found that exhilarating. I would never have imagined me being interested in that stuff, yeah? So get interested in friends who are interested. One of the great pains of social life is you can never have a wretchedly serious conversation. I find that so irritating and painful that you think, can we ever just have an actual grown-up conversation? That a serious conversation can include lots of laughs and usually needs to. But can we actually talk about something, start it instead of just, I don't know, whatever it is we easily so end up doing and wish we didn't do. So get interested in interesting friends. Read people who are interested is another way of getting interested. Read Bishop. Read Schopenhauer, at least in McGee's book about Schopenhauer, which is all I've read. Read people who are interested. Read Orwell, for instance. Whether you agree with Orwell or not, it's neither here nor there. He's really interested. He's really interested. Read Auden. Auden's interesting he's got the most wacky ideas, but think, golly, I've never thought about that. Read people who open your mind up. Read people who make you interested. So I think before we even get to the questions of insight, we need to get interested. We need to get interested in life. We need to think into life. So, that little event of Ria ringing me to go through the book list, I got interested in her being interested. I think, isn't it interesting, the nature of interest? And isn't it interesting that children are just as interested as adults, and it's just as specialised, and if you're clever, you can just talk into their interest, and they talk forever. But if you then say, how did you get on at school? What did you do at school? They just say stuff. And that's because they've just lived all that, and they're not interested in that. You have to find out what they're interested in. And that's what friends try to do. And at best, most of our thinking is done in dialogue. So part of what we're trying to do is to train ourselves to think. Thinking is lighting up your mind. It's not opinionating. It's not this dreadful tendency that so many of us have now of taking off an ideology off the shelf and spouting it. I'm now positively allergic to it in any form. Thinking is about thinking into life. Your 10-year-old half-daughter, as I call her, rings you up and says, "Here to," and it lights you up at times. It makes you think. It makes you, golly, that's interesting, the nature of interest. Yeah. So the first thing to train in all this, never mind insight and enlightenment and golden figures, is get interested in stuff, find out where your interest is, and get your interest moving in more interesting directions. Directions that are going to deepen, that's going to broaden, that's going to crack open your ideologies, your assumptions, your stories, and open up a world of wonders, because that's where we actually are, in a world of wonders all the time. So that was my first thing I really wanted to say, is just sort of cultivate interest. And do that this week. Get onto something interesting. Stop flicking through Facebook and liking, the next thing that somebody said about Mr. Trump. Find a way of getting interested, yeah? Even if it's getting interested in the fact that you're bored. Get interested in that, yeah? But what we're trying to get interested in on these evenings, and for tonight and last night at least, is the first of these 4 gateways to liberation, as we're calling it. We're trying to get interested in the nature of impermanence, which is and what the Buddha is saying about that, he's not saying enlightenment is impermanent. He's not actually making a metaphysical comment. The Buddha was what's known metaphysically reticent. He didn't make metaphysical comments. He doesn't speculate. So, for instance, the Buddha sometimes teaches non-self, and sometimes the Buddha doesn't teach non-self. And basically, he's not teaching it as a metaphysical postulant. He's teaching it as whether it's useful or not. In certain situations, thinking in terms of non-self is useful. In certain situations, it's not. Yeah? He's not making metaphysical statements. He doesn't speculate about things. He just says, think of it like this, approach life like this, see what opens up. I can't tell you about what opens up, but if you approach life in this way, things will open up. Yeah? He's not saying impermanence will open up and you'll realise that everything is transitory and it's not really saying that. He's saying if you go into this great mark of impermanence, if you really go into that, there's a liberation that comes from that, which you can't really speak about, but it's not described as all things are being impermanent. It's actually getting to a consciousness beyond any designation of permanence or impermanence. Yeah? Something quite that you can't think about. But the main thing, of course, is to start reflecting on impermanence. So I want to say 1 or 2 things about that, and then we'll finish with the meditation. The first thing to say about impermanence is to attend to when impermanence really breaks into your life and hurts you. Yeah, because that's when you're most likely to be broken open. So I talked about in the winter retreat, but my sort of holiest moment of awareness of impermanence is sitting at my father's bedside just after he died. And the reason I think of it as a kind of holy moment is because I had no views about what happened. In that moment, moment's actually too short, in the period of time as I sat with him, I had no views about what happened. It wasn't that I thought he'd died in the usual sense. It wasn't that I thought he continued in any sense. It wasn't both or either. I had this kind of And I want to use this language of holiness because the language of holiness is a metaphor for something more than ordinary consciousness. I mean, that's what religions have always done, haven't they? They've tried to say, no, there is some other way of being altogether. The trouble is, so many religions, in doing that, create more separation between those two things. You create a really existing God and a really existing you, and the gulf between them opens up, if you see what I mean. So actually, if you're not careful, that attempt to say there's more than ordinary consciousness, everyday consciousness, actually makes it harder to get out of it, if you see what I mean. But religions have always tried to say there's this wholly other way of perceiving, and it's nearly always to do with love, isn't it? It's nearly always to do with, and actually you just love in that state. That's the simplest way of putting it. But if you don't say that well, you actually create more problems. You create really existing deities and really existing yous. Yeah? But when I sat at my father's bedside, I really had no view about what had happened. This actually only occurred to me on the winter retreat. I keep going back to that story. Again, it's one of my ways of how I work. My interest is not particularly with metaphysics, it's to do with everyday life and finding in everyday life something that goes beyond it. But it's taken me, I don't know how long he died ago, 20 years I think, to realise, I didn't have a view. That's why I always go back to that moment. It was holy for me, because I had no view at all about what had happened. I wish I could stay in that. It lasted for quite a long time because, and I don't think you thought about this today, I remember I wrote a sort of report, in an order journal called Shabda, writing about this experience of my father's death. And at the end of this report I'd said I couldn't imagine going back to my life here. I was living here then and living in the community and teaching like I am now. But I couldn't imagine my life here. And again, I hadn't realised quite how much I meant by that. And what I meant was that for a long time I couldn't imagine my ordinary life, doing things and organising things, and as if life was going anywhere, and as if I knew things, and as if other people knew things. It just seemed dreamlike, that life, completely dreamlike. I couldn't imagine getting on the train and popping out into it again, after this holiness of not knowing anything, especially not knowing about death. I had no view. And in that no view was this incredible silent liberation. A really holiness, it's the only word I can have for it. A taste of a wholly other consciousness that doesn't need you to have a view, that there aren't any views to have about anything. The trouble is, even that can be so misunderstood, because that's, I probably have to correct this next week, but because I'm already thinking, that's problematic, and I'll come back to that next week. So attend to moments where impermanence breaks into your life and hurts your life, like that, or you can do it retrospectively, because that's what I've noticed I've done. Is I've been thinking about, why does that moment stay with me so much? Why has it got a kind of glow to it, like the glow of the Buddha? And it's because it's got no view. So you can go back in your life. When did you realise you didn't know stuff? You know what I mean? If you attend to it, it's got this kind of majesty. And you wish you could stay in it. You wish you could stay in it. And you can't. Human beings can't, because we're driven by ideology so much, including ideologies like me, myself, male, female, all those sort of things. But then I just want to then suggest one way of reflecting on how we might reflect on it in meditation. And what I want to suggest is that in your meditations this week to come, that you do this reflection at the end of the meditation, at least like three or four times if you can. I sometimes spend my whole meditation, recently I've been doing this. Yeah. I talked a bit about it on the winter retreat, but it's worth recapitulating. So the Buddha said, when he talked about impermanence, he said, our human life is like a dewdrop on a blade of grass. Yeah? Our human life is like a dewdrop suspended on a blade of grass. That's what our life is. That's a description of our life. Yeah? And he means us to take this as a view. So you take up the view that our human life is like a dewdrop suspended on a blade of grass. It's very, very fragile. It's about to disappear. Yeah, it's also very beautiful. Remember, it's very interesting to attend to the image. The image itself is an image of fragility and incredible changingness, but it's also an image of beauty. Yeah, and we'll be coming back to beauty. It's very, very important, beauty, because it suggests a way beyond. So what we'll do in a moment is that you might even bring that image to mind. You remember that that's our human situation. Whoever we think we are, whatever we believe, whatever we cherish, whatever we're kind of stuck on, positive or negative or whatever, our human life is like a dewdrop on the blade of grass. Yeah? So you take up that view. So one way you might do it in meditation is do your mindfulness of breathing for a while and do Maitreyabandhu. So in other words, soak yourself in that samadhi, that enriching state for a bit. I mean, that's probably 2 grams of what most of us are doing, but at least settle down a bit, yeah? Try and stop thinking about Star Wars. Settle down a bit, and then just remember, you just bring up, the Buddha would have said, you just bring up the view, you just remember the view. So one way of remembering it is just you remember that you're going to die, yeah? Absolutely, definitely you're going to die. No, you don't know when, but you're going to die. And you were born. You were born, yeah? You were born, and because you were born, you're going to die. And that space between the baby and the dead body is just like a dewdrop on a blade of grass, yeah? And if you've got children in your life, you see that really vividly. You know, I've got all these photographs of me and Alex and Ria, and I'm still wearing these clothes. They've just got bigger and bigger and bigger. You know, Alex is about this tall now. But I was only, in my meditation this morning, remembering lifting her up to put her on the floor when I was trying to feed her. You know, and that's just like 11 years ago, and it's like that, yeah? So what you try to do is you bring to mind that reflection. You don't think about it too much. You just remember that I was born. You might even go back in your mind, I was born, and I'm going to die. Before I was born, endless time without me. You know, so many people you read, you were not there. You know, I'm reading, Brian McGee on Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer died many, years and years and years before I was even twinkle in my father's eye. Yeah? So before birth, a sort of seemingly endless sea without you, and after death, a seemingly endless sea without you. Yeah. So what you've got is just this dewdrop suspended on a blade of grass, and it's like between that. That's our life. Between that are these 2 vast unknowns. Yeah. I want to call them dark seas, but that's too. We don't know whether they're dark or not. Actually, what we've got is this chink of light, this dewdrop in the middle. So you just bring that to mind. You might even reflect on your death, reflect on your birth. Then there's endless times without you either side. So and then you try to get really close up to any sensation you have now. In that little dewdrop quivering on the blade of grass, you try to play with, and play is the best term, play with feeling every sensation you can, because it's in this tiny chink of light. It's in this. So anything in this moment, anything in this life is absolutely precious, because most of the time on this earth we're not there to witness it. And there's no world for us then. No self and no world. So try to see if you can bring that view, and then that's your background view, and then you're trying to be really alive to the particular sensation. Even if it's something like you're criticizing someone in your mind, you're angry at me because I've said something you don't like, you're lusting after someone, feel what that feels like. And what happens is we solidify around things. And we solidify around things, and that makes them solid and they perdure. We think, no, this is me, I believe this, I don't agree with that. I say this to Mr. Trump, I say that about this subject. Often what we solidify around is our ideas, including our ideas about ourselves. But if you can practice like this, it breaks up that solidity. It breaks up that me solidity, that my ideas, my beliefs, my cherished goals. Yeah, it breaks them up. Yeah, and that's a liberation. Yeah, that's a liberation. As soon as we get identified with I'm a this sort of person against those sort of people, and the reason why for my suffering is these sort of people, we just make ourselves like a block, like this solid thing that perdures through time. And that doesn't exist. It's something that we've fully created in our mind. If we can remember that life is like it actually is, get really close up to any sensation, you'll break up. You'll start to break up that tendency to solidify around me, my beliefs, my thinking, my things, my lovers, my ideology. Yeah? You'll start to break up. So let's do some of that, and I'd like you to try to do it at least 3 times during the week in your meditation.